Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation on the topic of IEEE Open Source Initiatives, Advancing Technology for the Benefit of Humanity Using Open Source Technology. My name is David Stankiewicz. I will be your MC for today's session. I want to thank the IEEE Standards Association Corporate Membership Program for hosting this exclusive webinar. So thank you, Standards Association. During today's presentation, our three speakers will talk about open standards development and open source developers being able to choose from a wide range of rules and tools. And they will also examine some of the variations and the reasons why one may be more appropriate than others in any given case. And then finally, our speakers at the end will cover how the IEEE in particular plans to leverage open source communities and applications for both humanitarian and standards development efforts. So before I get started, though, I do want to go over just a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. So if you join today's webinar listening through your computer's speaker system, also known as VoIP or Voice over IP, then this means you should be able to hear the entire audio broadcast without dialing in using a telephone. At the end of the presentation, we'll take questions from you, the audience, so you have the ability to ask our guest speakers a question using the WebEx chat feature. Simply type in your question to the host, that's myself, David Stankiewicz, and click the send button. At the end of the presentation, we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. I also want to make a note to everyone here on the line today. We are recording today's presentation, so if you miss any portion of the webinar or you simply want to rewatch it on demand, we will make both the on-demand version of the webinar as well as the slide deck available, and then we'll communicate that to anyone who's registered. We'll let you know when and where to find that. Our agenda for today is listed here. We'll start with a brief speaker introduction. I'll kick that over to them in just a minute. I'll let the speakers introduce one another. Gary Stubing is with us. He's going to talk about what open source is and why the IEEE is involved in open source. Andy Updegrove will cover licensing and the legal ramifications of open source. And finally, Alfredo Herrera will end us with humanitarian applications of open source at IEEE. And then, like I said, for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll take question and answer from you, the audience. So what I'll do right now is, Gary, I will kick it over to you and the speakers. Take it away.
I'm actually an employee of Cisco Systems, and I'm Gary Stubing. I'm employed at Cisco Systems. I've been involved with the corporate advisory group now for almost 3 years at the IEEE. About last year, I think it was last year, or actually it's just the year before, we kicked off an effort to try to understand where open source would fit within the IEEE. And I was asked as a member of the CAG if I would be an ad hoc chair for this subcommittee. So that's where I come in. Andy? All right.
Hi. Thanks, Gary. I'm a lawyer out of Boston. Over the last 30 years, I've helped set up and represent over 100 standards organizations, and then over the last 10 years, several dozen open source foundations. Over the past several years, I've been particularly busy in helping to try and build IP bridges between the two. As we'll talk today, there are some challenges in helping them operate together, but the rewards are substantial. Alfredo?
I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa, and I've been involved with IEEE humanitarian efforts since 2009, and currently in the Humanitarian Activities Committee. And yes, back today, right?
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's over to me for now. This is Gary. Stephen again. Can you put up the first slide, David? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an intro to open source. It'll be very brief. I think most of the people know what open source is. Andy's going to go into a lot more detail from the perspective of the legal ramifications of open source, and Alfredo's going to give you some examples. But one of the things that's been happening at the IEEE is there's been questions asked relative to where does open source fit within the IEEE, and that's what our ad hoc team was trying to understand and trying to put some bracketing or some efforts around to get an understanding and then try to gently introduce open source into the IEEE. Next slide, please. So, having done that, open source. Well, basically, open source is software, and it has to meet some specific requirements. Those requirements are known as the open source are basically the open source definition, and a lot of people refer to that as OSD. All of this is maintained and managed by a group called the Open Source Initiative. And when you talk about open source, they're listed here, but there's like 10 elements of being open source. You've got to have free redistribution. There's no royalties involved. The code goes out there. It's out there for distribution or redistribution, and it's all royalty free. It's all source code, and the source code is made available again on a royalty-free basis. There's discussions about derived works. Andy's going to get in. Derived works is kind of an interesting area of open source, and Andy will probably get into a little bit more discussion on that. There are things in open source code, in the licensing of open source code, where there may be some attribution restrictions. In other words, the author of the open source might have some restrictions in there on how the open source can be used, or modifications to the open source and what happens to that and how it comes back into the libraries, etc. There can't be any discrimination against persons or groups. Anybody can get at the open source code. There's no discrimination against fields of endeavor, so in any particular field you can use this code. The distribution of licenses applies automatically to recipients, so anybody who gets it has to abide by the licensing of that. The license must not be specific to any product, and the license can't restrict other software, and the license must be technology neutral. And if you want to get a list of this and some more definition around that, you can go to the address I've given you there, and it will give you all of the definitions of what is related to those topics in open source. Next, please. So, why open source at the IEEE? Well, we believe that it's going to innovate solutions and advance technology for the benefit of humanity. I mean, that's typically what the IEEE has always tried to do with all of its standards. We believe that the standards are there to advance technology for all of humanity, and open source is going to be one of those tools that we believe is going to be part of that. We think that it might help develop some economical solutions for things like developing nations. It could solve problems and challenges in those developing nations because it's free. There's no cost, so people could build solutions around open source. Now, Alfredo's actually going to talk about that a little bit. It has the ability to empower applied technology education and experimentation from personal member interests. So, and what we mean by that is we think that open source within the IEEE is going to allow us to provide some educational offerings. It's going to provide us with things like abilities to demo solutions that we might develop, and we're hoping that it will benefit personal members' interests from a perspective of how they can use this and apply it to things that have been developed in the IEEE. We also felt that it was going to engage a diverse and energetic community outside of our traditional membership. The traditional membership has been based on things like, everybody knows 802 and other things like 802.1, Ethernet, and Wi-Fi. Well, we won't call it Wi-Fi, we'll call it 802.11. But we think that with open source, it'll give us an opportunity to diverse a little bit and provide some solutions outside of the hardware solutions. And that would become pretty non-traditional for the IEEE, and it's been kind of an education within the IEEE to get to this. We are currently working on this now. The ad hoc committee is currently working on use cases, and these are going to be given to the Standards Association Standards Board, and we're hoping to develop some demos or possibly some solutions from the standards, the SASB or the Standards Association Standards Board. Say that 4 times quick. Next, please. So, why are we here? The Corporate Advisory Group initiated the ad hoc about 2 years ago. So, this is the CAG, and I'm going to give you some, which means Corporate Advisory Group, and I'll caution you that not all of the members of the CAG are members of the ad hoc. A great many of them are, but the Corporate Advisory Group has these members, and the corporate or the CAG ad hoc for open source has a subset of this, along with members from other areas of the IEEE who are in other standards, in different societies within the IEEE, but the ad hoc is currently, I believe, in getting maybe 15 to 20 people on a call. So that's what we've been working with over the last year. We were tasked with the objective of, does open source have a place in the IEEE? And if it does, how do we integrate open source into the IEEE? Next slide, please. So what have we done? First, we determined that, yes, there is a place. In fact, what we found was there were a couple of standards that were actually out there using open source to prototype, to demo. So we were already seeing open source being used within the IEEE. We started scoping out the initial open source engagement, and this has been very difficult, and once you hear Andy's talk, you'll understand why. But it was, where are we going to put it? What's the repository going to be? How is the licensing going to work? There's a number of different, basically prototype licenses out there where you can, that give you a good basis for how do you do licensing. And we were trying to decide which one of those do we use, and then how do we apply that within the IEEE. The next thing was, what is the application of open source within the IEEE? And then, of course, we went to the next steps. So, next slide, please. Are we there? Yes, we are. Thank you. So, in the fourth quarter of 2016, we had the initial package, and that was basically what I've just given you, is what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? What we're trying to do, starting this quarter, is we've actually started putting together some use cases that we're giving to the Standards Association Standards Board, and they're going to look at how that can be integrated into the standards process. So we're expecting actually to have that done. We've actually started that at the end of this, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we're actually hoping to have some of those to the Standards Association Standards Board by probably the middle of next month. And then the phase 2 is pilot projects and operations, the market introductions, of which this call is part of that, trying to let the world know that the IEEE is going to be engaging in open source and where that's going to fit, and educating people on what it is we're going to do and how we're going to license it. And so that's part of what this whole webinar is about. And then hopefully by the end of this year, we're going to have an official introduction, and it'll become basically something that's in the IEEE at all times. So it'll just become a part of the offerings within the IEEE. In phase 1, we're still continuing the experimentation using multiple licenses, and we're currently utilizing the IEEE GitHub for a repository. We're working our way through the licensing agreements. I believe that we are pretty much settled on Apache 2.0, but I'll let Andy go into that a little more. Next, please. So Andy has been retained, so the legal resources have been retained. The education is being done, this webinar. The licensing model has been determined, and like I said, it's going to be, for the most part, Apache 2.0. We're still working on possible IP issues related to other models. I mean, there's other people that want to use other licensing, so we're trying to understand what are the IP issues related to that. I mean, one of the things about the IEEE that is very, very important is how is intellectual property handled. So we're trying to work our way through that. The lawyers are still in discussion on some of these other issues, but they're currently working on those offline, and the ad hoc is continuing to move the work forward from the perspective of getting the use cases to the Standards Association Standards Board. The open source use case template has been developed, and it's under review by the CAG ad hoc, so my member team is currently looking at that. We've defined an open source project within the IEEE P2413 group, and they're currently working on that. And as you saw in the previous diagram, we're working on phase 2. Next slide. So the integration, phase 2 will be the integration of the standards process, and like they said, we're identifying those key use cases now. We're getting ready to share those with the SASB chair. In fact, we've had a couple of inquiries from him as to where this is, but we're working on that. And hopefully by late Q3, early Q4, the ad hoc is aiming to develop the suggested processes and policies and integrate those into the IEEE, have some scenario tests and pilots and processes to work through the various cornerstone areas that we've identified, and present the suggested processes for endorsement and approval from all appropriate IEEE-SA governance structures. So we hope to have that done at the end of the year. And that's kind of the intro, and I will pass it over to Andy.
Next slide, please. Gary's already given you a bit of an introduction to open source. I'll add one additional dimension to that. You may also have heard of free and open source software, and the reason I mention both of these is because they're sort of a good lead-in to the broad range of licensing practices that are out there in the industry. In each case, as you know, open source means not just object code, but human-readable source code as well. And when in an open source situation, both of those code bases go forward into the marketplace to be used. In general, licenses to open source software are more generous than commercial licenses, but as we'll see in some of the licenses, there's some additional restrictions that would be uncommon in a commercial setting that are added on to them. These manifest themselves in one of two types of licenses, broadly speaking. Last count, I think there were somewhere in the realm of 70 approved licenses at the Open Source Initiative that Gary had mentioned earlier. That's the nonprofit that decides whether or not a given license does or does not meet the open source criteria. And out of those 70, there's sort of a spectrum that goes from light to dark in terms of increasing numbers of terms, but broadly they fall into either copyleft or restrictive licenses and permissive licenses. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those. Next slide, please. Free and open source is characterized by the so-called restrictive or copyleft licenses. You may have heard the name Richard Stallman. Richard is the sort of the progenitor of the FOSS movement, and he was the person who established what are referred to as the four freedoms, which you can read here. I won't reread them, but the concept is that open source, broadly speaking, should be regarded as a common good, but not just a common good, but a common good with the responsibilities to give back to the community benefit in exchange for the benefit that you've received from being able to make use of open source contributed by others. So as we'll see, these four freedoms would not exist unless they were reflected in a license that guaranteed them to those that have access to and then redistribute open source software. You can see there's a citation there at the bottom to the Software Freedom Foundation where you can see the additional discussion of why these are there and what they mean. Next slide, please. So a copyleft license has a number of different terms, but there are a few that receive the most attention. The GNU public license, the general public license, which is sort of the cornerstone license of the FOSS community, has gone through three versions. You don't see the original GPL much anymore. You do see the GPL2 and the GPL3. We don't have time to talk a lot about it today, but different communities tend to use one license over another. Linux, for example, is under the GPL2. A lot of the work that's done by community members that have strong feelings about the four freedoms may be under the GPL3 license. But to the extent that commercial enterprises get involved in projects that have used the GPL, it's more likely that it'll be the GPL2 than the GPL3. As I said, there are a few terms that get the most attention, and the one that stands out is the give back term. And what that says is that, and this is the sort of community good concept that I mentioned earlier, it says that if you're going to get the benefit of everyone else's innovation and efforts, you ought to be willing to contribute back your own. So if you receive code under a GPL license and make changes to it, and then want to redistribute the code commercially, you incur a number of obligations. The centerpiece of which is you will make those modifications available to everyone else. So without going into the details, which get a little technical, basically, if you want to use it internally, fine. You don't have to share with anyone. But if you want to make money off it, then through a variety of specific rules, you have to let other people make use of your improvements as well. Conjoined with that is an obligation to carry that obligation down through further sublicenses. So it's not just the person that makes the changes that's bound to carry them on, it's anyone who makes use of them and redistributes. So once a GPL, always a GPL. And there's an additional term which means that as a generality, if you combine GPL code with other code, that other code becomes subject to the GPL terms as well. That's an extremely quick and shallow review of an extremely complicated topic, but unfortunately it's all we have time for today. Next slide, please. Open source software is different principally in that it does not contain those additional restrictions about giving back and cross-pollinating other code inclusions with GPL terms. So while all GPL code is open source software, not all open source software is GPL. It's a more relaxed definition that restrictive licenses fall into, but doesn't require as much as the restrictive licenses do. These licenses can range from very simple to very detailed, but happily only a small number are frequently used. So while there was a sort of fluorescence of licenses where individual companies, governments, other interest groups made little tweaks to licenses. For the most part, people have fallen back into using quite a small handful of licenses for the very great majority of all code. Next slide, please. And here's an example of how that shakes out. Every year, Black Duck Software does a number of surveys. One of them is a analysis of millions of different projects at GitHub, and it analyzes that code to determine what licenses that code is subject to. Interestingly enough, the MIT seems to be resurging. I actually helped draft that almost 30 years ago at the X Consortium. That seems to be on the up these days. The GPL, you can see, is second in line. And then after that comes the Apache license 2.0 that Gary mentioned earlier. Then you have the GPL3, and finally the BSD license 2.0. Everything else is less than 1%. Each license is less than 1%. And if you were to add them all up just the licenses you see here, you can see that those 65 odd other licenses are sharing a pretty small percentage of all licenses out there, even though they continue to exist and to be available. Next slide, please. So the IEEE currently is focusing on 3 licenses. One of them is the BSD 3 license. That was the 5% one you saw before. The other is the Apache. And then the third, which we won't really talk about much today, came from CERN in Switzerland. That's a license which is explicitly for hardware designs. So that's a little bit too complicated to get into today, but we will talk briefly about the BSD and the Apache. So as I mentioned, some of the licenses are very simple, and the BSD 3 clause is one of them. As you can see, it's just a copyright notice and then 3 very simple terms. Include the copyright notice, include the terms that you see here, don't pretend that the copyright holders or contributors in any way are endorsing your distribution. And then finally, there's a disclaimer, which is a little bit too long for me to put in here, but it's pretty much what you've seen in every software license you've ever seen, as is, no extra liability, etc. So the concept behind the BSD license is basically, hey, here's some code, use it. And other than, showing where it came from and saying, don't come back and sue us, that's really it. It's an extremely permissive, unrestricted license that's intended pretty much to let anyone do anything that they want to with that code, including change, redistribute, bundle, whatever they want. Next slide, please. The Apache license, in some ways, is similar in that it seeks to provide very similar freedom of use of code without including significant restrictions on top of what you saw in the BSD license. But what it does do is it tries to be a lot more specific on the legalities. So that's one of the reasons that the Apache license came into place, especially after software became broadly patentable. At the time that the BSD license came out, the patentability of software was in a far different legal place than it is today. So the Apache license, among other things, includes a specific patent license, whereas under the BSD license, a patent license is at best implied. And the community of developers would say, well, of course it's implied. Wouldn't make any sense if it didn't have a patent license. But commercial vendors and lawyers are a little bit more leery because it's not traditional to have patent license rights unless they're explicit. So the Apache license fills in that blank and says, yes, this does include a patent license, and it also provides greater, detail and certainty in other areas. It's frequently matched with a contribution agreement, so that when you make a contribution to a product, you're specifically providing all of the permissions that would then be outbound again in the downstream license that the project puts out. So they're sort of bookends to a common theme. You'll see that in other settings, particularly more community developer-driven settings, contribution agreements aren't used. They'll use something called a certificate of origin. But IEEE would like to have more certainty in the rights that are granted for the benefit of downstream users, and therefore the intention is to use a contribution agreement. Next slide, please. Actually, a contribution agreement for each of the licenses that will be used. Many people are familiar with the Apache contributor agreement because that's in use broadly. People are less familiar with specific contribution agreements with respect to the BSD or the CERN license, but the current intention is that IEEE would have a contribution agreement for projects that use either of those two licenses as well. And in the ad hoc, we're currently reviewing drafts of each of those three agreements that will eventually get recommended to the appropriate level in IEEE that would approve them for use. So, what does all this have to do with IEEE, which is a standards organization? Well, as has been mentioned, there's a number of use cases where standards organizations are increasingly taking up open source. The most tricky one is where a standards project decides, you know what, for this section of this spec, it would just make a whole lot more sense to drop some source code in here. We might as well do it. It saved everybody a lot of time. It would provide certainty. It's kind of maybe a commodity situation. So instead of a lot of people, wasting time writing their own interpretations of this section of spec, why don't we just put some code in here that they don't have to use, but that's there for them to use? The problem is that a traditional IPR policy doesn't permit consumers of the spec to make changes to and then redistribute any section of a specification other than in the form of a finished product. So tweaks are necessary in order to widen out an IPR policy in order to make it possible to manage those code inclusions. But there's other situations. I mean, very frequently these days, a project will decide to make a reference implementation of the entire specification. And then there could also be test tools. So as Gary mentioned, there's a number of use cases that the ad hoc is considering and then making recommendations about the best way to manage open source in those settings. Next slide, please. So the challenge is how we manage these on an IPR basis. Fundamentally, there's a couple of disjuncts between the two systems. Standards only make sense if you can't change them. And that's where you get interoperability from, by everyone agreeing to do certain things, certain limited things in the same way. On the other hand, if you look at those four freedoms inherent in the very concept of free and open software and open source software, they include the ability to change and distribute what's part of the collaborative product. So it takes some effort. And as you also heard, Gary mentioned that open source software is traditionally distributed royalty-free, whereas one of the cornerstones of standards development has always been, at least in many standards organizations, that you can not only are you allowed to include reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, but a reasonable royalty as well. And the historic range of what are considered reasonable and non-discriminatory terms are broader than the terms that are permissible in open source licenses. So it takes some work to build bridges between these two and work out ways for them to play nicely in the same sandbox. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a really fast review of a really really complicated topic, particularly for those of you that may not be very familiar with open source. This is an article I've written that gives you a good overview of where it comes from, why it is what it is, where it's going, and some of the licensing issues that we've talked about. Lots of other stuff out there, but here's the start. So thanks for your attention, and Alfredo, over to you.
Alfredo, you need to unmute your mic.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you. So, yes, thank you, Andy, for that, very good cover of licensing, particularly. Thanks also, Gary, for the presentation on the standards ad hoc and the CAG. On my part, I'm fairly new to the standards, and I wanted to bring some of the challenges that volunteers are facing when they're trying to share some of the solutions they have developed for humanitarian and sustainable development efforts. So next slide, please. So many of you, or some of you, may know that at IEEE there are many humanitarian activities, and that includes things like educational activities like EPICS, one of the EAB programs, or some traditional things like what the IEEE Foundation has done in the supporting EPICS move and the Smart Village. The Smart Village is a program from the foundation where they donate equipment to business people in developing communities, and then work with them in making that a sustainable activity for them, so where they can provide LED lighting and solar panels so that the people in the community can have electricity, and the IEEE that way enables the community to get, to a better standard of living. There are other things that are being done through the Humanitarian Activities Committee, where I volunteer, and also in TAB. And there are other parts of IEEE where there are none of these humanitarian activities. But as you can see, there are many volunteers in many parts of IEEE that are involved in these types of activities. Next slide. So yes, and this has been going on at least, in my experience, for at least the last 9 years. Before that, you would have an article in Spectrum or the Institute about a group of volunteers doing some great work, electrifying a community, a school, donating some equipment. But in 2009, IEEE decided to bring together a lot of volunteers and to tackle specific problems that people face, where a technology would be a solution for that. And they named that the Humanitarian Technology Challenge. And of course, since then, many things have happened, and some of the activities under that challenge had become, the Smart Villages program. Other, like EPICS, were kind of started at the same time on the educational front. And the committees like the HAC committee have evolved from that. But at the core, back then, what people wanted to do is that they understood that there's technology could be used for certain areas, and these humanitarian technology solutions, they thought they could be, if they've adopted a standard interoperability, then you could have parts of a solution being used in other areas, in other applications. So that was understood from the beginning. That was the goal, to have this type of projects funded by IEEE and deployed by members in different areas of the world to help people either get out of poverty or improve their conditions. Next slide. Yes, so like I said, it is understood that members want to share for these specific use in humanitarian, but there are two things that also became challenging for us, and one of them is that, for example, if you were to use some code or some program from that you would create, you have to define if you own that and you're allowed to share it. Or if you have it from an open source, how would you then maintain that since it requires a lot of maintenance and all that. So the desire from IEEE to share is there, to broadly share with all these solutions, but understanding the intellectual property right challenges and how to enable a lot of the work that IEEE does, in standards and publications became difficult. Next slide. So a lot of the members back then looked at solutions that were already available, already deployed. Like on the software side, you have the examples of SourceForge or GitHub, or different open source repositories where you can go and find code that you can use if it was a software solution. At the time of the HTC and some of the products that have happened within IEEE since, because people, in some communities do not have electricity, or they don't have computing facilities or things like that, then it became more of a hardware solution that people were looking for. They were looking for connectivity. They were looking for, 3D printed limbs that you can see here at the bottom left. They were looking for farm equipment, like what's available already. And some of these solutions are open source and they exist already. And a lot of the IEEE volunteers wanted to leverage that and use it in many ways. And for IEEE, for us, and myself, we've been trying to work on what is the best way to share that within IEEE and use it, but in a way that it not just benefits that project or those volunteers that are doing the work, but also leverages, it helps the whole of IEEE, provide technology for the good of humanity, right? Next slide. So looking at the platforms and the way people share open source and free software, one of the things that is obvious, that became obvious to us is that there are nuances on what it means to review code and to ensure quality for things that are being shared in an open way. For free and open source software, you have the notion of peer review, but peer review, it is, when you release your code and you make it available to the community, you do it so that they can debug it, examine it, learn from it, fix it, modify it, combine it with their own. And that is part of the definition of free and open source. But within IEEE, the notion of peer review is different. I know it for myself from the publications, conference publications or paper publications. When you submit a work within IEEE for publication, people are going to look at that and they're going to see if it is your own, if you haven't plagiarized, if you haven't used it before, if it's novel, original, has technical merit, things like that. And the work that IEEE members have been doing for humanitarian, if we try to leverage the open source hardware and software that's available out there, the quality is not always there. So it required an extra effort for us to actually vet that and use it, or, to develop our own. And if we did, then maintaining that to a certain level. So this is the one key question that remains in how, how we go about, addressing this, the need to ensure quality if IEEE is going to release software and hardware in an open source way so that others can share it. On the standards activities, I know that standards goes through a lot of activities in discussing and reviewing what's being developed until it gets to the voting process and vetting and goes out and released as a new standard. So there is that quality again, and I'm really glad that open source that IEEE has decided to move into open source, and that's going to benefit the work that volunteers are doing for humanitarian activities. Next slide. So just I have a few slides just about the committee that I'm part of and the work we're trying to do. And I have 3 examples of open source, non-IEEE and also IEEE, a project from IEEE, just to show you more in detail what it means for volunteers that are trying to leverage open source and the challenges that that brings, but also the opportunity that IEEE has in leveraging those efforts for the benefit of the members and also for society. So this committee, the Humanitarian Activities Committee, is one of the standing committees of IEEE that is appointed by the Board of Directors, and the goal is to carry out and support impactful humanitarian and sustainable development activities, meaning that, we will fund projects in Bangladesh, in Latin America, in Asia, in different places, so that volunteers can do work there, do a project with a school, with their communities, with themselves, building things or collaborating with others, so that they can help others, with the basic needs, right? But also, the one thing that is particular about this work, and that is different from any chapter or student branch that IEEE has, is that the work of these groups that we're helping is to actually develop a project and deliver on something that will benefit other people. And for that, we're trying to encourage people to do what we call feet-on-the-ground projects, meaning that the project has to be local, people have to be involved with the community and connected to them, instead of doing them remotely or parachuting somebody from myself being in Canada, going to another country and try to do work there. Not because IEEE could not do it, but because other groups are doing that, and we want to complement that work and excel where IEEE excels, which is local volunteer involvement in technical work. And the HAC supports projects, education activities, learning and best practices. And we're partnering with other organizational units within IEEE, like INTAB, like the Foundation, like EAD, and also Standards Association, in seeing how we can align our efforts with the goals of each of the OUs so that we can still do this work, but in a more impactful way. Next slide. And there are some guiding principles that we have adopted. And one of them is to abstain from doing harm, meaning that, for example, if we help a group of fishermen put solar panels on their boat, and then we help them, test that solution and so that they have electricity for that work, that the boat won't capsize, for example. We don't want to put out solutions that may risk the life or the wellness of people that are benefiting from that. And that's the way we try to encourage everybody within our programs to I encourage them to consider that and to take, make sure that they don't do any unintended harm from the good they're trying to do. The other thing that has evolved from how the humanitarian work from IEEE started was we're trying to align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look for that, I don't have a link here. I'll probably add it on the slides that maybe share. But it is these are 17 goal areas where the United Nations has identified needs for which IEEE volunteers can find solutions and work on projects and programs. And also we're building this community, and for open source, on the open source side, if we build a community around a technical solution and develop best practices around that is a way to bring together IEEE volunteers to deliver a technical solution that that help people out. So next slide. So these are the three guiding principles in always building around community, the United Nations SD goals and not doing harm. And more specifically for open source, we are undergoing this effort to understand how to manage the sharing and the promotion of open source hardware and software solutions for the benefit of humanitarian projects, sustainable development projects. And for that purpose, for example, we have a GitHub repository that we're looking to populate with solutions that can be shared for these specific type of applications. Next slide. And there are applications like, for example, this is a non-IEEE open source project. It is an initiative from Dana Lewis. She has type 1 diabetes, and what she has been doing for the last couple of years is she because she needs constant monitoring of the level of insulin or level of sugar in her blood. She has been working on this Raspberry Pi system. It's an open source design that people can download and work on. But she uses herself this system so that she can control the insulin pump that she needs to use on a constant basis, so that she can level and manage her health. And the reason why it's an open source project is because she couldn't wait for the approval of a commercial version of something like this. She was able to create something similar on this Raspberry Pi platform. So this is the type of work that where many see the opportunity for IEEE to help out with standards, to help out with the architecture, to help out with software, with algorithms, many areas where things can become standards or they can become just, areas of research and areas where people can benefit humanity and health. So this is one of them. Next slide. There are other solutions that are software. And for example, this is another non-IEEE example where the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, they are working on a project to eradicate malaria. And so if you're familiar with the OpenStreetMap work, they're an open source group that they map, geographic areas, and they create these maps for general purpose. But, when there is a crisis, they also can map a city or an area after an earthquake or a tornado so that the first responders can go in and help. And in these areas, so in other areas in communications and software-based solutions, there is an opportunity for IEEE to understand the elements where there is a need for a standard, where there is a need for a technical contribution. And I really look forward for that, the opportunity for that to happen more, for that to become the norm within IEEE, that yes, you can publish the technical work in a paper about that research, but also contribute the code behind it so that others can benefit from that. And the last slide that I have is, second slide, sorry, is this IEEE solution where this group in Dhaka, Bangladesh, they created this rickshaw. And this rickshaw is a means to transport people around, and they're looking for it to have a lower cost version that can be used for commercial use, but also can use as an ambulance and things like that. And they consider open source, but of course, with open source, you also have the risk of having commercial players come in and taking your idea and develop and doing that at least cost and cutting you down from your sustainability or your income, right? And that's a concern also for standards. So there is a part of the IEEE open source effort where the licensing and the ownership of the intellectual property and how to make that a sustainable model for everybody involved needs to be really thought of carefully, because it affects also the innovation and how people can contribute overall to open source solutions for humanitarian. And there is one last slide that I'll skip, but the next one is just a model where we can see that, within a licensing the environment that IEEE sets, and that's the part that Andy was talking about, if the rules are understood and how things would be shared with others, and there is a process to release those hardware and software designs to the community for that loop, that you get from open source, then there is a real, a lot of potential for, benefiting both in technology but also in humanitarian and sustainable development projects. And that's my presentation. You have some details after that. Okay, thank you.
That's nice.
Gary, Alfredo, Andy, it's time for a Q&A. Are you going to address some of the questions?
Oh, I lost audio for a second. Am I back?
We got you, Gary. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. I'll turn some of the questions over, but I've been going through the list. We only have a few minutes. The questions about the IEEE CAG. There's a question about why AT&T wasn't engaged. But let's be very clear. The IEEE Corporate Advisory Group is a group that's elected by the Standards Association, which is the entity-based arm of the IEEE. So the CAG is elected or nominated from the members of the SA, and that's how the CAG is put in place. The ad hoc was members of the CAG as well as other members from the SA and the Standards Association. And these are all entities that are members of the SA. There's approximately 174. I don't know the status of AT&T, but it isn't a case that we excluded AT&T. They just weren't at the table. So that's that. There were a number of questions about the CERN license or the hardware license that we didn't go into. I think I'll turn that question over to Andy.
Sure. I guess the best way to summarize it, because as I say, it's complicated and we don't have a lot of time, is that it's intended to accomplish the same basic goals as an open source software license. Because we're talking about hardware, it's a little bit different, because what you're talking about is, it's almost like we're back to specifications as compared to code, because what's open source about it are the designs, and it's the freedom to use those designs to implement actual products. So as I say, it's hard to get any deeper into it, but the main takeaway is that the CERN license is intended to accomplish basically the same goals that any of the open source licenses are also intended to do.
Okay, let's see. Just kind of clicking through the questions. See if there's any kind of common theme. I believe that the deck will be made available. Is that correct, David?
Yep, that's right, Gary. We're going to share out the deck and the recording as well, so people can rewatch.
Okay. I don't even know how to answer this question. There was a question related to whether or not there would be a concern about, where is it? There was a question about whether we were concerned about this going out to the general public. I guess no more than we would have with any other open source GitHub type license out there. So, it's not a case of, are we doing something that's spectacular or out of the ordinary. I think the idea of answering open source within the IEEE is just an extension of what's already happening in a lot of the open source community. I don't have a good answer for, are we headed to a model where open source will be accessible only to IEEE members or only with IEEE standards charges? I don't believe that's the case, but that's part of the things that have to be determined over the next year. There was a question, Andy, does CERN license include patent licenses?
I'm sorry, does the CERN license?
Yes.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. We are now at the top of the hour. David, how do you want to handle that?
Yes, so there were a lot of unanswered questions. So I think what I'll do is, because we are at a time, I'll put your gentleman's contact information on the screen here. So if you had a question that unfortunately was asked and not answered, or you have some follow-up you'd like to do with Gary, Andy, or Alfredo, here are their email addresses. They've all told me that you can just contact them directly with any follow-up. So thank you, gentlemen. And that'll take us out. So this concludes the webinar presentation. Again, Gary, Andy, Alfredo, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate and put together this webinar, which was super engaging, which is evidenced by the number of questions that came in. I think we had about 32 questions that went unanswered. So a really engaged audience. Again, the slides, the recording, both going to be made available and disseminated to everybody who registered. So if you are registered, you will be notified when and where to find this collateral. And that's it. I'll take us out. Everybody, have a great day.